The slow movement of this sonata starts with a Christian chorale on the piano, and then the cello enters with a line almost like a cantor, a cantor improvising. And then the piano restates its chorale with the cello making Jewish comments in the background, or rather on equal terms. And then, to my great pleasure, the last phrase, the piano is being converted, and we hear the Jewish line from the piano, which I think is a very good story.
When he wrote his first oratorio at 25, Felix was still trying to prove his loyalty to his adopted religion.
In the early 19th century, it was traditional among German composers when they were writing oratorios that included depictions of Jews to make them very, very negative. And that's exactly what we see happening in St. Paul. From the very beginning, we have a chorus where the Jews have an uprising against Paul, and that leads very quickly into this very violent stoning chorus where they're shouting out in this very bloodthirsty tone, "Stone him to death, stone him to death." So I had the opportunity to hear this for the first time in English just this past year, and it was terrifying. It was really, really frightening. And the chorus is just up there screaming, "Stone him to death, stone him to death," and I feel like they're screaming it right at me. And it was unbelievably frightening, and I can't imagine what it would have been like to have been a Jew in the 19th century hearing this, sitting in the audience and hearing this. In St. Paul, Mendelssohn is working very hard to both prove the sincerity of his Christian faith and show his separation from Judaism.
But Felix also inherited Moses' interest in other religions, a bit like my dad. A couple of years after writing St. Paul, when he was 28, Felix wrote this piece of music based on an Islamic story.
He just absorbs everything around him in the same way that throughout his life he absorbed everything. He was able to pick up on different elements, on different religions, and turn them into something that was deeply personal. And so for me, Mendelssohn is just one of the most modern composers that we have ever had and probably ever will have.
A century later, my dad, a little boy in Germany, had no idea that all this religious confusion was about to turn his own life upside down.
Well, it was very boring. We used to sit in the gym on the floor and had to listen to speeches which went on a very long time. And I mean, the songs were a bit more catchy, and I used to like singing the Nazi songs because I considered myself German, really.
So marching around?
Marching around would not be my line.
So he wouldn't have made a very good Nazi?
I don't think so, no.
Die Leineweber haben eine saubere Zunft. Darum die Schulung, schrumpf, schrumpf, schrumpf. Mit Fasten halten sie Zusammenkunft. Darum die Schulung, schrumpf, schrumpf, schrumpf.
By his mid-20s, Felix was no longer just a prodigy. His works had made him famous. That success enabled him to break down barriers between people, just like his grandfather, but through music.
Well, I think Felix was trying to bring people together through his music, and he is following, in a way, the initiative of his grandfather, Moses Mendelssohn. He would do these huge music festivals with hundreds in the chorus and hundreds in the orchestra. The chorus would largely be comprised of amateurs, and he would insist that anybody, really, who wanted to sing could participate.
In 1835, Felix moved to Leipzig to run its celebrated orchestra. He was just 26. 7 years later, he founded Germany's first ever music college there to offer opportunities to those less privileged than himself. That same year, he returned to A Midsummer Night's Dream and wrote the tune that made him a global celebrity. His original score needed a big orchestra, which meant it would be rarely heard. So Felix made it accessible to anybody with a piano.
Mendelssohn had made a solo piano arrangement of the march. Basically, it's just the orchestral version transcribed for piano.
The musical world picked up right away that this was something special.
Now, it turns out that his friend Franz Liszt, who, of course, was the reigning piano virtuoso of the time, also made his arrangement of the Wedding March. Liszt is sort of decorating it with embellishments and changing things around just a little bit. And as we go further into his version, it becomes increasingly more difficult and more virtuosic.
Mendelssohn would have made of it.
Well, Mendelssohn knew Liszt very well. It's funny, when he first met Liszt in 1825 in Paris, he wrote of Liszt, hat viel Finger, aber wenig Kopf, which means he has a lot of fingers but not much upstairs.
By the 20th century, there were hundreds of versions of the Wedding March.
I have here a ragtime arrangement by Christensen. This has got to be from the early 1920s, I would guess. Quite a different notion of the march than perhaps Mendelssohn had in mind.
If Felix's ambition was to bring everybody together with music, he certainly managed it here. Felix himself married the daughter of a Huguenot clergyman. His sister Fanny married the son of a Lutheran pastor. For them, as for many German Jews, conversion and intermarriage became the norm. By the end of the 19th century, not one of Moses' descendants was a practicing Jew. The family's assimilation seemed complete. But all this intermarrying set a bomb ticking that was to explode in the 1930s. My dad's first experience of it came right at the start of the Nazi government, when his elder brother Roland left the shelter of home for the unknown world of university.
My eldest brother Roland was very quiet compared with my sister Ilse, who was rather loquacious. And he started studying just in 1933 in Tübingen. And among the students there was a lot of anti-Semitism, and he had a very hard time starting in a new place with all this going on.
At the time, back in Cologne, my grandparents had no idea what Roland was going through, finding himself revealed as Jewish, alone, in 1933.
And then he came back. And there was this story of my being slightly ill with flu of some sort. My parents went for a walk, and Roland was put in charge. When they came back, they said, "How's Walter?" And my temperature had gone up a bit. And Mother said, "Oh, his temperature's up a bit." And Roland regarded this as an accusation to himself, went to the top floor of the house, jumped out of his window and killed himself. It was a terrible business for our parents and didn't make the year 1933, in which Hitler came to power, any better.
Only years later did he find out about his brother's death. Meanwhile, his cousins found themselves in a strange limbo between the Aryans and the Jews.
When I was 10 years old, the name the Nazis had was a Mischling.
What does that mean?
That means I'm as well German as Jewish. And that was not good for me. I was a non-Aryan, nicht Irish. All of a sudden, I was not German any longer. I didn't belong to anything and anybody. And for a young person, it's very, very hard.
The entire family became trapped in the Nazis' obsession with what they called racial science. They used the word Mischling, or mixed race, to describe the intermarried Jews. They were determined to eliminate the Jews, but first they had to decide who the Jews were. They were following a long tradition of governments using science to justify their authority.
The Nazis invested enormously in medicine and the biological sciences, and they needed science in order to institute the segregation and the identification of Jews, to eliminate them from German society. They had the idea that the German nation was an organism which needed to be cured. It needed to be made fitter and stronger and healthier, and so that the physician was a physician not to the individual patient, but the physician was a physician to the German organism, to the German society, and to the German race. They wanted to use science to define who a Jew was and to define these pathogenic racial threats. The Germans spoke about pure Germanic blood. This was a favorite Nazi concept. They did have the idea that blood would be corrupted in some way if a Jew had sexual relations with a German, that some form of impurity could be transferred. And so the Nuremberg laws of 1935 were designed to prevent so-called mixed-race children.
But my family was already intermarried. To protect themselves, they had to make sense of this new world of classifications. 2 Jewish grandparents made you Mischling first degree. 1 Jewish grandparent made you Mischling second degree. It all made a terrible mess of the precision of the Nazi project.
The Nazis tried to define in which case that the persons of a marriage could come out Jews or not, and the children of them Jews or not. And here is written in what cases marriage is not allowed. Here is an Aryan wife and a Jew, the man, black. They are not allowed to marry.
Is that the door of the register?
Yeah. That is what we call Standesamt. They can't be married.
Amazing.
It means forbidden.